Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary friends, to tonight's performance of Liquid Snake and the Konami Code, with music by Inner Hell Commander and lyrics adapted from Kojima Hideo's 1998 magnum opus, Metal Gear Solid. At this time, we ask you to please silence all your electronic devices and allow our guard dogs to sniff your soiled handkerchiefs so that they might recognize you throughout the evening. Refrain from any and all flash photography, and should you need to leave your seat during tonight's performance, please do so as discreetly as possible, lest our genome ushers all be alerted and forced to chase you about the auditorium until such time as you might sequester yourself within a broom closet, women's bathroom, or underneath a cardboard box. We here at the Furidashi Playhouse recognize that you have no real options for an evening's entertainment. Nevertheless, we thank you for choosing us. Whether you're a war orphan, racist caricature, or cyborg experiment, the Furidashi players have something for you. And with that, we now proudly present Liquid Snake and the Konami Code. Who am I but a genome soldier? Who am I but a lonely friend? Why am I walking down this gangway? Will my vigil ever end? Where are we? Not in outer heaven. Where are we? Not in Zanzibar. Why are we guarding Shadow Moses when those who knows us decompose us? Now we are only genome soldiers, holding on to all our glories past. Could we be something more than chattel, fresh from battle? Oh my, how I prattle. Who am I but a genome soldier? Who am I but a lonely friend? Why am I walking down this gangway? Will this vigil ever end?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Furidashi podcast. It is the bright year of 2026. Happy New Year. I am your host, Lauren Ash, and I'm here with the amazing Nicholas, and it is my sincere pleasure to announce that I hope my audio sounds even better. I know, new year, same me. I am still promising things that I cannot deliver. Anyway, that's the hope. All right, here. On today's Furidashi episode, we are actually going to be coming back to and or forward in time to Kojima's foreword of the book, The Creative Gene. And we will be kind of demonstrating and kind of picking out the particulars of what does it really mean to have the genetic right, remixing, that he tries to talk about with memes, with these cultural touchstones that we pass from one person to another, the connections that we make along the way, and maybe all of, our clones or genetic replicas that we kill. That just very commonplace things. Yes, if you haven't guessed it by now, and or if you have not been following along, Lauren and Nicholas are going to be talking to you today about Metal Gear Solid 1998. Yay! The first one that a lot of people kind of recognize that because it is the first 3D. But it is not the first Metal Gear. There were 2 episodes before this one, so go take a look at those.
Yep.
And without further ado, we kind of just want to dive right into Kojima's kind of talking about how he believes that we transfer memes, but then this game itself, right, doesn't really maybe jive with that. So, Nicholas, go ahead and talk about Dawkins' kind of philosophy here and kind of revamp all that for our players.
Can I say one thing at the top of the episode that's sort of unrelated, but it's sort of been on my mind? I just wanted to let everyone know who's currently in Minneapolis holding the line against the thugs that have occupied their city, that I am thinking of them. I'm doing everything I can here in Iowa City to support you. And keep up the good work, fight the good fight, and I want you all to know that you are seen. All right, with that out of the way, I'm sorry, I wear my politics on my sleeve. You guys know this about me. So, way back when, in the first episode of this season, we talked about Kojima's memoir and the way in which he sees his own creative process as using memes in the sense of Richard Dawkins. For Dawkins, a meme is essentially, as Lauren noted, like the cultural equivalent of a gene. It is this thing that is like passed down through generations that gets remixed as it goes along to create new amazing things. And for Kojima in his memoir, this generally always had a like positive tinge to it. It's this idea of like, I transmit my memes to you, you transmit your memes to me. Together, we're all engaged in this collective creative process, and we're all flower children, and it's all really amazing, and we love it. Kumbaya, and so forth. And this episode, we're going to complicate that a little bit. But I wanted to sort of just get back to like laying the baseline to remind you that for Kojima, the meme then is this like it is like the gene, but it is this thing that sort of like it's not just about like here is this chunk of content that gets transmitted. There is another process there, which is the sort of the generational remixing of those elements. And so there's actually a good example of how this works in practice for Kojima in like the Metal Gear Solid like ancillary media itself, because so much of what happens in the game is dependent upon knowledge of at least what happened in Metal Gear 1 and 2. It actually includes summaries, in fact, actually pretty lengthy summaries of the stories of those 2 games. And what's really interesting is how in the summary for Metal Gear 2 that is included with Metal Gear Solid, Kojima actually retcons the story. And the reason why he has to do this is because when Metal Gear 2 came out, the fall of the Soviet Union hadn't happened yet. However, the game Metal Gear 2 was set after what would then was set in the future from that point in time, at which point the Soviet Union would have fallen. So he actually sort of like rewrites the story of Metal Gear 2 to kind of explain the whole thing in Zanzibar land as kind of like a failed post-Soviet state, basically. Even though that's very much not what it was in Metal Gear 2.
Yeah, and you actually... if I could just interject really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you actually see this a lot in franchises that have existed for several decades, or just several years, and like very many world history events happen. And I think that like we've kind of losing this, and this is something of a cultural touchstone that I actually wanted to call out that I actually quite liked as this retconning, because while he had to retcon it for world history, it was such a politically charged game, even though it may have been lost on a lot of people who were playing it at the time, though I don't think it was. that it is really fascinating to kind of look at it and look at our franchises even today, like particularly with a franchise you could say like Call of Duty, for example, that slowly but surely hasn't been having such charged kind of affiliations, but has kept some of it. And so one of like kind of the things that I always like to point out when we are doing this type of historical analysis is to kind of look at current modern titles and other modern franchises that you see outside of kind of Kojima's legacy, and like where are they retconning or where are they kind of sidestepping different issues instead of maybe potentially kind of calling them out. Nicholas, please continue.
Yeah, and so, but it's not just like the historical, or I guess you could say the lore elements that are being remixed. We're also remixing like gameplay ideas. I mean, they range from the silly to like, for example, if you recall in Metal Gear 2, there's a scene where you have to sneak into the women's bathroom in order to talk to this like one like, well, she's posing as a soldier in the Zanzibar land compound, but she's actually an infiltrator, and it's complicated. And it's a similar situation here where the main female character that we meet, Meryl, like she is hiding as one of like the Genome Soldiers in Shadow Moses. And in order to be able to sort of like talk to her away from all of the other guards, once again, Snake has to sneak into the bathroom to talk to her. Like that is, you know, it's a cheesy thing, but it's something that is sort of like brought back into the game again. Also the fact that like, you know, different types of flooring make different levels of noise that you have to be aware of. That was a thing that we saw in the previous games that's been brought back into this one. Or the fact that like, you know, guards have particular like cones of vision that you have to be aware of, or that there are cameras that you have to try to avoid. Like all of these things are being lifted from those earlier Metal Gear games and being brought back into this one. And I guess the only point I want to make with that, because, you know, obviously a sequel is probably going to use things that existed in previous games, but that what we're going to see as we sort of go forward in this discussion is that the thematic / story remixing is not fundamentally different from sort of like the mechanics / gameplay elements remixing. And that there's actually a really interesting interrelationship between those two things.
Yes, I'm super glad you actually brought up the interrelationship. Excuse me, I almost fumbled my words there, and or did. I'm so glad you brought up the interrelationship between the mechanics and the gameplay with the thematic remixing, because I think when I was talking about like the history element, and I was like, look, we're somewhat used to see these in modern franchises. Call of Duty is kind of the one that comes to mind, because when it first kind of was spun off with other game development projects and studios and the people that were running the teams at the time, it was very much we wanted to create something that like was kind of a spin-off of like government contracts and people who had actually been in the military and had been serving with the United States forces. And I think what's interesting, right, is in this game, I kind of bring it up because, you know, obviously Kojima has not. But second is also just, you know, classic USA tropes / like classic United States is persisted in the thematic legacy, kind of like here specifically. And when it's done in such a cinematic kind of like narrative framing, I think it's very interesting to see this perspective, like an outside US perspective of like what it actually means to be a soldier and the tools, the weapons, and what Snake has to do, and wrestling with that is a like indication of what actually is available to him. Because I think it's very easy for us to look at this as a remix of Metal Gear, the originals, and also going forward, these are just all remixes and he has guns and he has everything available to him. But as Nicholas is going to talk about in this episode and in others, it is really about the aesthetic choice to kind of combine why and motivations for why players should run and should hide and should be cautious and should be suspicious of the people around them instead of, say, just running and gunning, because that's what a Call of Duty is. So that's really, really exciting. So as we are going to talk about the narrative, like I want you to really, if you have played the Metal Gear games, if you haven't played the original, right, Metal Gear Solid from 98, go play it, go watch it. But when we talk about narrative, like I want you to think about the way in which we talk about the verbs we used to describe what Snake does in the mechanical and the system sense.
Yeah, I have a really good example of this. And I should note that like going forward, I'm kind of just going to have to spoil things. There's not really a good way to talk about this without spoiling it. So if you are inclined to play Metal Gear Solid and have never played it before, I would strongly suggest playing it first before listening to the rest of this episode. We will still be here when you get done, and you will have a really fantastic gameplay experience, even if a deeply sexist one. More on that later. All right, so there is a character in the game who first appears to you as this like cyborg ninja. In fact, that's literally all they're called when you first encounter them, is cyborg ninja. And so again, the two threads, if we're talking about sort of like the thematic / lore thread and its remixing, and then the gameplay remixing. So from the gameplay angle, this is reusing the the ninja fight from Metal Gear 1, where the mechanics are actually very similar. You have a ninja who's kind of like constantly teleporting to different parts of the screen. You have to try and anticipate where they're going to be. And similarly with this fight in Metal Gear Solid, that style of gameplay has been elaborated on. In fact, the fight actually has like 3 phases. But that basic idea that sort of like you have this extremely fast moving ninja character whose position you kind of have to anticipate in order to be able to hit them. So like the basic gameplay element is there, but then added to it, especially when you first fight him, is this very weird thing where like the more you hurt him, the more he wants you to hurt him. And so there's this very strange like, oh yes, pain, more pain, cause me more pain, that you don't really get a sense of why that is until much later in the game, when you learn actually that this character is actually Gray Fox from both Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2. And that Gray Fox, in the sort of the period between the end of Metal Gear 2 and the beginning of Metal Gear Solid, basically what Foxhound did was basically pick up his dead body, and then they experimented on him, kind of torturing him in the process as well, because he's very psychologically damaged.
Right. And so like I guess, content warning for people. I should have said that like before you had said that. But just FYI, we're going to spoil things. Like the themes of this game are very like tragic and visceral.
Pretty dark.
Actually.
They're very dark.
Pretty dark.
So what's interesting about Gray Fox / Cyborg Ninja as a character is that he has been remixed in a sense. And I use that term very pointedly because if you think about what Kojima says about sort of like plucking things from like other media and then bringing them into your own and remixing them and reusing them to create something new, like that has also then been functionally done with Gray Fox / Cyborg Ninja. However, that's not like the sense, at least that I got from it, is not the sort of like rosy, oh, isn't it so cool how creative we're being? Isn't that awesome? I'm transmitting my memes to you. You're transmitting them to me. No, it's horrific. And in the game, it's presented as horrific.
Yeah. So I think like this is a really interesting point, right? To kind of talk about like, I think that yes, like he is being remixed in like the genetic sense. But I think what's interesting is we have to remember when this is kind of like really early in Kojima's career, but this is kind of first foray into making like a movie, right? But making a game. Yeah. And when I think about like the idea of his whole kind of philosophy of like, look, when I was trying to make the Metal Gear Solid game, I wanted to like encroach kind of an idea or a thematic element kind of upon the people, like a part of himself.
Yeah.
That I think what's interesting is I agree with you that this is a very like kind of like very deep lore. Like Gray Fox and / Cyborg Ninja is like the deep lore character, right? There are arguments all over the internet, like trolls abound, even myself, right? I'm not hiding under a bridge. I'm, I guess, putting myself out there on a podcast. So I'm kind of under a bridge though, because none of you can see my face. Haha.
Maybe.
But yeah, I'm a little bit, of like the little gremlin under the bridge, being like, hey, Gray Fox is, I think, kind of a testament to maybe also like the way I think. This is what I'm thinking, right? If I was looking at it as this is actually interpretation for Kojima, is that this is the way he feels like his potential characters right? And also I think his IP is being kind of manipulated and malformed probably by the production studio, right? Or the production company. Like, I think it's almost like a warning cry. Like, I think this is a manifestation. Like, using the creative gene as a lens for the episode for kind of like my arguments here, like, I think it's a bit of a stretch because you can go way further into this. But when I see it, I think it is as a tragedy. I see it as something that is supposed to actually be like, not a foil, but like one of the many reflections of Snake in Metal Gear Solid, right? And so it's because this is about Solid Snake's journey, right? And so Metal Gear Solid, right, is about, are you, right, solid, right? I feel that's weird and literal with the wordplay, but it's like these are all fragments. And so Gray Fox is kind of like the person who is like, this could have been you, right? And I also was like, this is the way that, these are the iterations, like the creative things that like my developer wanted me, do you know what I mean? Like my publisher wanted me to make you this, right? This cyborg ninja. We should give him a metal arm. We should do these things to him. We should, right? And it's like Kojima, this is like giving him a lot of credit. Like, I'm not saying this is happening. This is all supposition. But it is something that's interesting that when I was thinking about Gray Fox, and I was kind of thinking of it more in terms of the like story and less of the creative gene lens. But with the creative gene lens, it's to say like, this is the dangers of remixing too much. Like, this is the dangers of just pulling out, right? And going, hey, like a vomit. Like, this is probably a great argument, right? For, against, like, you could say generated content that may or may not have,
Oh, Lauren.
I'm just saying, right? Like, I think memes are great, right? And I think that the transference of knowledge is great. But if you don't do it with intention and purpose, this is definitely, you could say, you get a fragmented mess. And at the end of it, it's like, please kill me. Please, I don't want to exist. I do not want to be here. And so that's how I see it, right? Which is why I love the creative gene lens, because I was like, oh my goodness, I think every character has actually like a lesson to be learned, like in a kind of these intentions. But did Kojima's intentions, right? Like, if that was his intention, once again, supposition, giving him a lot of credit here, match also, the manifestation in game and in mechanics, right? Did it actually hit?
Yeah, well, also to sort of like think of the dialectic interplay that we saw within like the creative gene itself. The other major theme that we saw in that text was Kojima's extremely complex feelings about parents, about parentage, about his own father, who it's not revealed in that memoir, but in interviews that he's given, his father was pretty abusive. Yeah. And so, like, there is this then difficulty with the fact that, like, sometimes the thing that gets transmitted is like a curse. Is like, or feel, maybe it isn't literally a curse, but it can feel like one, where like that predetermined like destiny, be it cultural or genetic, makes you feel as if you're trapped within, especially in like the themes of these games, a kind of cycle of violence that's extremely difficult to escape. And for a character like Solid Snake, who frankly doesn't spend all that much time questioning it. It always seems like it's the villains in these games that are questioning it far more. And then he's just kind of like, yeah, I like killing. Yeah, it makes me happy. Like, I feel alive when I'm in war. Yeah. Like, he's it's weird. He's weirdly shallow at times.
Yeah, I actually wanted to kind of, so there's two things. I think he's shallow in his responses because he almost kind of has to act as the player character as well, like an avatar for the player. Like, I want to get through this game.
Definitely.
There's also the idea, so that's on the one hand, right? There's like technical constraint and technical necessity of the medium, right? Yeah. I think on the other hand, though, you have a character that even when confronted with people telling you like a truth, I think there has to be a term for this, because I was, so Nicholas, side tangent, Nicholas and I went to the manga museum.
Yep.
And there is an amazing manga by, I can read the name in my head, but I can't say it out loud.
Well, we went to the De Young. We went to an exhibit at the De Young in San Francisco.
We went to an exhibit at the De Young in San Francisco. It is the manga exhibit. And by the time this episode airs, you probably won't be able to get to it, so I apologize. But I hope everybody gets a chance to kind of just read all of these. I cannot remember the artist's name. I'll have to look it up on my phone because I'm terrible. But her manga Wonder Boy put a subjective kind of boy who actually questions all of the kind of the other characters and people about what are they doing, what are their lives, and it's in very different time periods. It's set in very, like, there's also war zones and different other areas that are just basically he's questioning the why are those humans the way they are, right?
Yeah.
I think
I know who it is, by the way. It's Yamashita Kazumi.
Thank you. Can you say it again?
Yamashita Kazumi.
Yay! Thank you. I was like, say it for the beautiful people.
A really amazing artist also did Oku.
Oku. Yes. She is absolutely was phenomenal. And I actually did the audio tour as well, Nicholas, so that I could actually hear more about her life,
really?
her journey.
Yeah, you're going to have to tell me about that sometime. Yeah.
And saving the Western, like the Western property in Japan as well. Anyway, it was really fantastic to do it all over again. I did it twice, actually. I might go a third time. Who knows? I became a member because I just loved this exhibit.
Get to your point, Lauren.
Okay, my point is that in Wonder Boy, right, the protagonist, the player character, is the one questioning the moralities of the people's relationships around him. But in Solid Snake, and in all of the Metal Gear Solids, the player character technically as a constraint. Like, they can't do that because the player might not agree with Snake, right? But if the player isn't given a choice, like dialectically, they're not able to kind of put that into their character, right? They're not going to project. So I think that what's interesting is that Snake almost has to be shallow, technically, but that means that every villain and every other character, right, instead of being shallow, can literally then question Snake's own motives, even if Snake can't question his own. That's kind of the point, right? Yeah. And so I'm thinking this actually raises some really great questions about, well, then what does in Metal Gear Solid, what are those questions, particularly, right, that all of the villains kind of represent? And that's why I kind of talked to them about fragments, like mirror shards, almost of Snake's relationship to Foxhound, to the United States in a way, and all of that kind of extensive metaphor use kind of throughout every single villain.
Then I actually think that the Psycho Mantis fight is actually a really good way of thinking about how, like, the fight itself is a kind of metaphor for the game as a whole. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with it or aren't going to play Metal Gear Solid for whatever reason, so the Psycho Mantis fight begins with him mind controlling Meryl into doing certain things and to attacking Snake through her and also kind of trying to get him to fight her. And the reason why I bring this up is because there is a sense, actually in all the Metal Gear games, that you have sort of like the players in the immediate moment, people like, Solid Snake, or like, when you're fighting Liquid Snake, or when you're fighting Vulcan Raven, or whoever the bad guy happens to be. But there's that layer of the people who are sort of like fighting on the ground. But then there is this other layer of people who are essentially like puppeting all of these people and like manipulating them into doing certain things. And so that would be like Colonel Campbell or Naomi Hunter, or also like Liquid Snake. Liquid Snake is kind of doing both at different times. And so the way in which Psycho Mantis controls Meryl and manipulates her into doing something that she doesn't want to do, and Snake then has to confront that situation where it's like he both does have to fight her, but he has to fight her in such a way where he won't irreparably harm her. And so what's really interesting about that is that it takes a plot beat, like Meryl is being mind controlled, and then uses that as a mechanical justification. Going back to what I was saying about sort of like this interweaving of the story and the gameplay mechanics, where like now, like technically as Snake, you still can use your SOCOM. You can use the machine. You can use the FASM is the machine gun he has. Like you can use all of those things, but you will get a game over if you just outright kill Meryl. So it actually puts a restraint on you to use more of like your grappling and your punches and kicks and so forth, because you need to knock Meryl out without actually killing her.
Right. And I think what's amazing here is that it's so easy, I think, for us as gamers and developers to just say, well, of course they would do that. It's because it's narrative. He just wanted to tell the story. So, like, I guess we have to limit the player. No, people, I think that is a little bit of a shallow argument in that it obviously is what I've heard before. But I think this is a great way for us to kind of highlight, right, to talk about the the fact that there is a narrative beat here, there is a theme, but also in recognizing that it was just as easy for them to not have a mechanical constraint, right? And then just trigger the cutscene. I don't think players would have been satisfied. They would have been gone, wait, I can just kill her, but actually she's not really dead. Think about how often that happens in boss battles now with like the 3-phase boss battle.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's because like in a way now, you as the player and Snake is kind of taking over. If you do, right, act against Snake as a character who would not want to harm her, you get game over. But if you now are taking on the idea that Snake doesn't want to harm her, see, Snake now has kind of authority and control as a character. Yeah. You are now embodying, right, the narrative theme, and you are now embodying the kind of mechanical theme, right, of doing something that is non-lethal towards Meryl. Because ultimately, right, that is the theme and the narrative that it is trying to tell you.
Yeah, and I also think that's why then all of the sort of the things that are pointed to as kind of like the goofier elements of that fight, like the fact that Psycho Mantis like uses like the haptic mechanism in the controller to like make it shake, or the fact that like you have to so for those of you who have never played this like on the original PlayStation, one of the things that you would have had to do is you had to actually like unplug the controller from like whatever port it was currently in and put it in the other one so that you would be able to use it again. Also, Psycho Mantis like reads the data on your memory card to see what games you've been playing to make fun of you for it. Like all of that stuff is there not just to be goofy. Like it is funny, but it's also there to highlight this other aspect that we're talking about, which is that like you as the player are being brought into the circle of the lore building.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to say. I'm actually really glad you mentioned the PlayStation controller stuff, because if you aren't listening to our Patreon, on the Patreon episodes, we talk about camp as one of our points in our hex plot graph. Yeah. And camp is just so important in video games. Like, and usually camp is unfortunately what we get shorthanded in the development circles as fun. So things that are like being clever, things like the haptic feedback, things like when the PlayStation 3 I think finally came out, or I think it was PlayStation 3, and the first games that launched for it were like, you need to tilt the controller in a certain direction because of the gyro.
Because it had the gyro,
Yeah, right? Like consoles used to would force game developers to kind of think in this really interesting way. And so the Psycho Mantis fight, while it gets camped, it gets cheesed, is also a psychic fight against the player. That is what the Metal Gear Solid games do. They bring you into the experience by constraining both your mechanics and then constraining your perspective and your narrative. And I just think that man, the PlayStation 1 and doing all of that stuff was just a wild time to Nicholas. You know? And so I think that it is, I love it. It's it is psychological warfare, right? And then what's even better is that by literally calling the villain Psycho Mantis, right? Yeah. And then also even in dialogue being I guess he is pretty psycho, right? Because I think he also gets this redemption arc, right? About why he is the way he is. And not redemption. He's not really redeemed. I'm just saying, you do eventually defeat him.
Well, he's not really redeemed, but he does have this sort of, dying monologue that he gives that definitely reflects negatively. So, it doesn't even reflect. It, preflects on what Liquid actually says at the very end of the game in his 17,000 monologues that he gives you as you fight him. And because what Psycho Mantis says as he's dying is so he also quotes Dawkins, but he quotes Dawkins parentheses derogatory.
Yes. Yeah.
Because what he says is that the genetic imperative to sort of transmit the essence of who we are through subsequent generations, that is actually a self-destructive force. That as far as he's concerned, that's why people make war in the first place, is because of the conflict that arises from I want to pass on my genetic material versus you passing on your genetic material. That brings us in conflict with each other, and that's what causes us to war. And he's extremely melancholic about it. And I mean, I think we can talk a little bit more about Psycho Mantis later, because you're going to have to listen to the Patreon episode for that.
You are going to have to listen to the Patreon episode for
I will know one thing that he says, which is that and I'm unfortunately skipping ahead a little bit in the our show notes. He says before he dies, he says, "Before I die, I want to be by myself. I want to be left alone in my own world." And what's really fascinating about that is that sort of in many ways it kind of, and I'm using this as a transition, Lauren, just so you're aware, that this sort of reflects what video games are becoming historically. So if we're thinking about the late 90s, so it's 1998 when this game comes out, what is happening at this time? Well, we have these consoles that are coming out. We have the PlayStation 1, we have the Nintendo 64, we have the Sega Dreamcast, and then in a couple of years, we will also have the Xbox. So putting all of these things together, like what is happening? Well, arcades are declining in popularity, and people are doing more and more of their gaming privately at home. Maybe, doing a little couch co-op, but it's like a situation where the experience of playing a video game is becoming more insular. It's like what Psychomantis says here. I want to be left alone. I want to be by myself in my own world. And my own world of this game, and the sort of like the insularity of the way it sort of surrounds me in a nice, comforting, immersive blanket. And it's unfortunate, for me at least, it's unfortunate that we sort of transitioned away from an environment in which video games were primarily social, mostly because that's what I grew up with, but also because it's going to lead to a kind of storytelling that, in my mind, is far more introspective than games prior to sort of like this particular generation of console and like the stories that come out of it will be. You'll start to see a lot of incredibly introspective games. Like one of the most popular games for one of the best games for the PlayStation 2 a generation later will be Silent Hill 2. Also the Silent Hill game, which I believe was originally for PS1. Like these are deeply introspective games. And the whole environment of like sitting down on your couch, like being immersed in this particular story, even if it's a bit cheesy at times, it is to Kojima's credit that like there is a kind of dialectic building within the game itself. Because even though Psychomantis is fighting on, the side of Liquid Snake, their ideologies are in many ways opposed to one another. And I think it's kind of telling that all of like the bosses, so to speak, that Snake fights before getting to Liquid Snake, he actually reconciles with, and they help him. Psychomantis opens the door that to the tunnel that will then lead to the facility where the Metal Gear is being constructed.
Yeah, this is a great kind of point, if I can jump in, Nicholas.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say this is actually a great point to kind of like reiterate and highlight when we use the words like insular. You can also use another similar word, like intimate. Or immersive, which is something that Nicholas had already kind of said. But I want to really highlight that because I think in these intimate moments of all of the boss battles and all of the death, you're actually kind of seeing something very telling with Kojima's like kind of boss strategy, is that each kind of boss is like representative. I keep thinking of like fractions, and I keep thinking of these mirrored kind of like shards of Snake himself's journey through like
they're definitely like
history.
Partial reflections.
Like these partial reflections of Snake, because in order to like reconcile his own genetic identity, the boss setups have to be reconciled. They have to help Snake. And I think you see this in many other future iterations of the Solid Snake franchise as well, is because it's reconciling and if not reconciling, like at least shattering kind of the reflection, or like at least making peace with it, like seeing that you saw a bit of yourself in that boss. And so when we look at the way consoles are being developed during this time, right? So this is the 90s. And we also look at the way now, I think in modern games, we're kind of trying to go back to social. Like I feel like a ton of social games are all of the norm now. Like gaming is incredibly social again. Definitely. In a way that is following, because everybody now can own a computer. Everybody can own a phone, right? And in so much in that even the phone games are incredibly social. If anything, like they're probably the most social, even if it's just you're talking about them. Is that then when you look at this in terms of like the narrative arc and the narrative kind of plot beats of like the boss battles, like I actually do see this kind of like, you know, almost like a point for point, like look at these reflections of like things that I, as Snake's identity, have become. Look at kind of the reflections of now I, Kojima, am able to create kind of a similar experience to kind of the movies and to the films that I watch that touch only me, right? Because even if you go to a movie with your friends, it's really you watching it in your head. And you're not talking, I mean, even if you're kind of side gabbing to your friend on the side, right? Like you're not really talking through the movie. Like they're like, please be quiet and silence your cell phones, right? And I get mad if someone's like eating popcorn too loudly. So that's a very intimate experience, but it's made for a wide audience. And so I think the philosophy here, right, is really holding true to now we have console development. You're no longer making an arcade game. You're no longer making something that maybe everybody plays. But even if someone comes over to your house and you set down the console, you put in the cartridge. Wow, yeah, you put in the cartridge. These were discs.
Well, for some
now,
of them,
Lauren.
yeah, because the PS1 is a disc. Nintendo 64 still had cartridges.
The N64 is a cartridge. The PS1 is a disc. Obviously, you see, I started on the N64, or at least at my friend's house. But you put in a cartridge or you put in a disc. Even if you're sharing in the experience, you watching someone is intimate, right? You're now watching something, and so this is really fascinating because now we have Snake himself, like watching these reflections of himself. That is not a transition at all in any way, shape, or form.
But the thing is, I think the intimacy is really kind of important here, and I kind of want to talk about this because yes, the game is very much you're correct. Like in terms of like its production, the game is clearly trying to be a movie. Like it has all these cinematic camera angles. Like it thinks about the sort of the spatial relationships between characters, close-up shots, mid-distance shots, distant shots. Like this is all cinematic thinking, but
yes, but
in many ways, I think the sort of like the intimacy that you're pointing to, which for me sort of like the dark side of that is insularity, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. But like that relationship between the player and the game is far more literary than it is cinematic, at least to me. Because what the game is inviting is that you spend a degree of time and like thought and effort with the game that, generally speaking, you don't really spend with like, big budget films. Maybe sort of like more artistic films or less so like art house films, things like of that nature, or like, your classic like independent cinema. But we have to remember that like for as much as we talk about this game as having these like deep philosophical themes and sort of like complex politics, this was a mass market game. So it's entering into the same environment as, say, like a regular action movie. But for me, the relationship that it's kind of conjuring between the player and what's going on is far more one that you understand in the way as if you were reading, say, like a really good science fiction or fantasy novel.
Right.
And the fact that Kojima himself is such a like voracious reader, I don't think he can really help but design in those terms, even if he isn't necessarily like signaling that as sort of like his primary influence.
I absolutely agree with that. I was going to bring up book reading as well, but I like kind of went to the cinema route. But I actually loved the kind of argument for when you look at all of these kind of boss fights, when you look at the set pieces, when you look at these as like plot beats, like you really get to see a sense of Kojima's rhythm and narrative arc kind of understanding, where almost every single boss fight is like the end of an arc, the end of a chapter, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're like chapters. That's exactly right. Yeah,
they're exactly right. And I think that it's like when we are reading this, right, it also then created a narrative, a gameplay pacing. Like, oh, I finished that boss, it's time to put down the game and like go do some stuff, right? And then come back to the game. And I think you kind of start seeing this now in modern games with like campaign design has chapters or campaign design has levels, right? And it always has had, or acts, right? Like
Yeah.
Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And I think that it's this level of kind of thinking and intimacy of like, this is what I would want to read. This is what I want, the player to get. That then, because it is a game, it almost has to be a little bit more literal. And so I think there are a lot of elements of, especially these boss fights where, like you had mentioned with Liquid Snake's like 17 different monologues.
Yeah.
It's because like each one of those is like another thematic arc or another thematic chapter, another thematic beat. I definitely think in modern times, like if I tried to pitch something like that, because I also kind of come from a voracious reader background, or more of a kind of traditional writing background, I definitely know that would get cut. But I also now, as a modern gamer and modern developer, would not do that either. So it's really funny to me, and I'm trying not to laugh on air too loudly because it's just kind of one of those humorous things where I'm like, this is a moment though where you almost kind of have to have Liquid be that crazy ass kind of like fight from one end to fight again, to fight to come back, to restate something that some other character has said, to state it positively. Like, I think it's been really kind of fascinating, because then it's almost as if each act is a remix of the different mechanics, and then you get to the end and you get to Liquid Snake, and then now you're going like, here's the culmination. And it's what makes it such a, I don't know, I don't want to say iconic boss fight to me, because it's like multiple boss fights in my opinion.
Like at least 4.
It's like 4 or 5. Yeah, it's at least 4. I don't know why I'm remembering 5, but it's so many segments, because it's a whole nother movie. It's a whole nother movie.
And then there's the fight on top of the Metal Gear. No, so the Metal Gear itself, Gray Fox intervenes and you fight the Metal Gear again. Then there's the fight on top of the Metal Gear. And then there is the and then there's the escape with Meryl. Yeah, so I kind of put all of that together into sort of like one extended like link encounter. So yeah.
Exactly. I do think it's one extended encounter, but it is like the act 4 of a 4-act structure movie where it has the climax and all of that. And then almost the Dark Night of the Soul is also kind of in there in terms of like, Solid Snake, like, what are you doing? Like, you are just the same as I am, only I am the cursed. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's
I am the recessive. You are the dominant genes, Solid Snake. And he always talks like this the entire time.
I mean, what? Yeah, but a beautiful voice. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, yes, thank you. If I have to listen to that villain monologue 17,000 times, I will listen to you say it.
Yeah, the voice acting. Yeah, for first generation games that have like extensive voice acting, like the voice acting is actually quite good.
Yeah, and I think
even if a bit schmaltzy at times.
It is. It's a bit schmaltzy at times, but like, I like the schmaltz.
It's also kind of and the thing is, I think Kojima can get away with it because it's also sort of indicative of his style. Like, he's not 100% serious all the time. Like, it is kind of goofy at times. So if the characters sound a little goofy, you're like, oh yeah, that's what a Metal Gear game is like. It's just the way it is.
So I think this is actually a great opportunity to kind of like wrap this kind of all up, because as we kind of go to Liquid Snake, we're kind of at the end of the game. Right?
Yeah.
And we're also kind of now moving towards an idea where we've seen the reflections of how each kind of boss battle is kind of building up towards the narrative arc. It's building up towards the theme, and each one represents different. The reason why each boss has different mechanical constraints and different systems that you need to use and different kind of like mechanics is ultimately because the story is there, right? That we're trying to tell. It's a set piece for plot, but it is also maybe the set piece happened first. The mechanics were thought that they were cool, right? And now we made a plot for it. And so as we kind of get to that idea of, well, we're remixing and iterating and we're being creative and we're transferring, like, let's round this out with kind of like, well, what are some of the other kind of thoughts that we haven't really spoken about on this?
So, I mean, if we're gonna end on talking about Liquid Snake, and I guess one of the things that he brings up, and we alluded to this already, is this idea that, like, so he presents his relationship. So he reveals, quote unquote, to Solid Snake that they are brothers of a sort, in that they are both sort of like genetic derivatives from Big Boss. So Big Boss is their father, which is something that Big Boss had revealed to Snake in Metal Gear 2 at the very end. And so what this actually appears to mean, at least according to Liquid Snake, is that sort of like genes were extracted from Big Boss, manipulated, and then turned into sort of these sun-like maybe clones, maybe something else, in the form of, Liquid Snake and Solid Snake. And so then in that sense, they're brothers. But not only the two of them, but also like every soldier that you have fought throughout the entire fought or knocked out or avoided or whatever, all the Genome Soldiers, like they too are these genetic derivatives from Big Boss. But what's interesting about them is that they are all kind of defective in a way. And that one of the things that Liquid Snake is trying to do the thing that sort of sets off everything that happens is that, they take over Shadow Moses, and what they want is for the U.S. government to hand over Big Boss's body. And the reason why Liquid Snake wants this is so that he can harvest the original genetic material from Big Boss in order to deal with the flaw that exists in his quote-unquote children. And so there is this sense that, Liquid Snake is in many ways sort of like your classic, goofy anime villain, but also there's this idea that, he is trying to correct for this thing that is sort of, indicative of the post-Cold War. It's we had this Cold War throughout the 20th century that had all of this, military technology, all of the psychological warfare, genetic testing, and so forth. So there's all this stuff left over that most of the powers that be want to sort of, disavow. But Liquid is actually trying to maintain and, keep a salient, keep in the conversation, so to speak, if we're thinking about this thematically. He doesn't want it to be erased. He doesn't want it to be papered over. And that, from his perspective, Solid Snake is like this as well. He, too, is one of these, holdovers from this era that no longer exists. And that if they don't do these really drastic and, in some cases, terrible things, then they are going to be erased from existence. In other words, their memes, their genes, however you want to think about it, will not be transmitted and remixed going forward. And this is sort of their struggle for survival. And I think what Kojima is maybe doing with this game, perhaps explicitly or maybe even without thinking about it, is pointing to this way in which there are things that we may want to disavow about the past, but they may actually perpetuate themselves in, I guess you could say, cursed or strange ways if we fail to acknowledge them in the way that sort of the legacy of the Cold War kind of bled out in the 90s.
Yeah, I really like that interpretation or that kind of thematic resonance, because I definitely think that the idea that he historically had to retcon, but for history, right?
Yeah.
In order to kind of make a similar point that I think when we started this episode, we were kind of talking about how while Kojima's intentions and the way he talks about Metal Gear Solid as both as the original and as the franchise is that he wanted to show kind of about how to pass on kind of creativity and these memes kind of in a beneficial way. And I think what was really fascinating hearing you kind of talking about that these are all of the dangers, right, that could happen, is that I kind of feel that he did manifest a sort of kind of monologue, if you will, of him going, these are all of the ways in which when you conceal, I'm not saying conceal your sources, but when you can overwrite the past and you can rewrite the past, these are all of the ways in which the memes can live on, right? The kind of genetics live on, but the kind of foundations, the history of them, right? Have to be revealed. And if not to others, to Solid Snake himself, but to someone, to even yourself to remember. Yeah. And I think this is really, really true, especially with someone for Kojima, because he is also so heavily influenced by so many films and so many books. And he is almost like himself, a remixer of those properties. But because he's not writing a book or because he's not making a film, he is able to weave them into a gameplay narrative that is a little bit more kind of subterfuge, right? We don't always see his inspirations or kind of the intimacy that he had with certain properties, because now we're playing a very different kind of game, a very different interpretation. Yeah. And so For that, I think that Metal Gear Solid is a great game. I enjoyed playing what I did of it. I really enjoyed watching the movie that I needed to watch for our Patreon episode. And so in order to figure that out you guys need to go and see that. Nicholas, is there anything you want to leave our beautiful listeners with?
So I had my final thoughts. I'll just do some promo stuff at the end here. I want you all to go over to patreon.com/Furidashi if this discussion has really sort of piqued your interest and you would like us to discuss more of the details of sort of like the sorts of media and influences that Kojima was looking to in making this game, and also the way that sort of impacts the gameplay. We will be discussing that there. But aside from that, you can follow Lauren and myself on Blue Sky. Lauren is at Espresso Cat. I am at Academicality. And if you don't necessarily want to support us on Patreon, that's really fine. We will take you however you are. And given the, I guess you could say, difficult state of the world in the current moment, especially where Lauren and I live, I want everyone out there to stay safe, stay true to your principles, and find joy in whatever you can possibly find joy in these days to keep you safe and to keep you sane.